The hotel room in Vienna smelled like cigarette smoke and expensive cologne. A woman sat at the edge of the bed, barefoot, her dress unzipped halfway down her back. On the nightstand, a half-empty bottle of champagne, 2 glasses, and a diplomatic passport that didn't belong to her. She wasn't looking at the passport. She was looking at the briefcase on the floor near the closet, its brass lock catching the dim light from the curtained window. Outside, a car door slammed. Footsteps in the hallway. She didn't move. Her hand rested on the bed, fingers brushing the edge of a small leather purse. Inside it, a camera no larger than a lipstick tube, a folding lockpick, and a West German driver's license with her face and someone else's name. The footsteps stopped. A key slid into the lock. The door opened, and a man stepped inside. Tall, graying, smiling in that easy way men do when they think they've already won. What I'm about to tell you, well, it might surprise you. Before we go on, make sure you're subscribed, so we can keep bringing you stories like this. Her name, for the purposes of this operation, was Claire Besson. French mother, Belgian father, educated in Geneva, now working as a translator for a minor consulting firm based in Brussels. That was the cover. The truth was different, and it lived in a sealed personnel file 3 levels below the main floor of CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. She'd been with the agency for 6 years. Before that, she'd studied linguistics at Georgetown and spent a summer interning at the State Department, where a quiet recruiter noticed how quickly she learned to read people. She didn't look like a spy. That was the point. She looked like someone's mistress, or someone's secretary, or someone's concerned niece. She had soft features, brown hair that fell just past her shoulders, and a way of smiling that made men feel clever. Vienna, in the winter of 1979, was a city of old empires and new suspicions. The Cold War had no front lines here, but it had meeting places, hotel bars, opera house lobbies, quiet cafes near the Ringstrasse where diplomats drank coffee and pretended not to watch each other. The CIA had a station inside the American embassy, but most of the real work happened outside it. Claire Besson had been in Vienna for 3 weeks. Her assignment? Get close to a Soviet diplomat named Viktor Sokolov. Mid-50s, senior trade attaché, married, based out of the Soviet mission on Reisnerstrasse. He had access to economic intelligence the agency wanted, shipment schedules, embargo workarounds, names of Western businessmen willing to play both sides. The problem was that Sokolov was careful. He didn't drink too much. He didn't gamble. He didn't talk to strangers. But he did have a pattern. Every Thursday evening, he attended a reception at the Austrian Trade Ministry. Afterward, he walked 3 blocks to a wine bar called Das Fenster, ordered a single glass of Gruner Veltliner, and sat by the window, alone. That's where Claire met him, not by accident. She'd been there the week before, sitting 2 tables over, reading a French novel. She didn't approach him. She just let him notice her. The second week, she was there again. This time, when he glanced her way, she smiled. Polite. Nothing more. The third week, he stood up and walked over. "Forgive me," he said in German, "but I think I saw you here last Thursday." She answered in French-accented German, apologetic and charming. "Yes, I come here sometimes. After work. It's quiet." That was how it started. A conversation about wine, then about Vienna, about the cold, about how the city felt like it belonged to another century. She didn't ask him what he did. She didn't need to. He told her, vaguely, that he worked for the Soviet mission, something administrative, very boring. She told him she worked as a translator, mostly contracts and technical documents, very boring as well. They laughed. He offered to buy her a glass of wine. She hesitated, then accepted. By the end of the evening, he'd asked if she would be there the following week. She said maybe. She made him work for it. That was important. If it came too easily, he'd suspect something. But if he felt like he was winning her over step by step, he'd believe it was real. Langley approved the next phase. Claire's handler, a man named Donald Richter, met her in a parked Volvo near the Danube Canal 2 days later. He handed her a new set of documents. Credit card receipts, a lease agreement for a small apartment in the 7th District, even a birthday card from a fictional aunt in Lyon. "You're building a life here," Richter said. "He needs to believe you're staying." Claire nodded. She knew how this worked. The cover had to be deep enough to survive scrutiny. Sokolov wasn't stupid. If he checked, And he would. He'd find traces of Claire Besson everywhere. A bank account, a phone listing, a neighbor who'd seen her coming and going, all of it fabricated, but none of it rushed. The agency had been laying this groundwork for months, long before Claire ever stepped into Das Fenster. The affair developed slowly. That was how Sokolov wanted it, and Claire let him set the pace. Dinner at a quiet restaurant near the Naschmarkt, a walk along the Ringstrasse after dark. Then finally, 3 weeks after they first spoke, he invited her to his hotel. Not the Soviet mission housing. That would have been too dangerous. But a small, discreet hotel on Lerchenfelder Gasse that catered to businessmen and the women they didn't bring home. Claire accepted. She packed the leather purse. Inside, the camera, the lockpick, and a small vial of sedative she hoped she wouldn't need. She dressed carefully. Not too glamorous, not too plain. A dark blue dress, heels she could move in, a coat that looked expensive but wasn't. She arrived 15 minutes late. That was deliberate. Men like Sokolov appreciated a woman who made them wait. Inside the room, Sokolov was nervous. He poured champagne with hands that shook slightly, and he talked more than usual, about the opera he'd seen the week before, about how beautiful the city looked in winter, about how lonely diplomatic work could be. Claire listened. She touched his arm. She laughed at the right moments, and when he finally leaned in to kiss her, she let him. But her mind was elsewhere. She was watching the briefcase near the closet. She'd seen him set it down when he entered. Leather, brass lock, combination dial. He hadn't opened it. That meant whatever was inside mattered. After an hour, Sokolov excused himself to the bathroom. Claire waited until she heard the water running, then moved. She crossed the room in 3 steps, knelt beside the briefcase, and pulled the lockpick from her purse. The lock opened in under 30 seconds. Inside, files. Not many. Maybe a dozen pages, folded and clipped together. Typed in, Russian. She didn't read them. There wasn't time. She pulled out the camera, flipped through the pages one by one, and photographed each sheet. The shutter was silent. 6 clicks. Then she closed the briefcase, spun the lock back to its original position, and returned to the bed. When Sokolov emerged from the bathroom, she was lying on her side, smiling. He smiled back, relieved. He thought everything was going according to plan. He thought she was just a lonely translator who'd fallen for him. He had no idea who she really was. Not yet. That would come later. But in that moment, in that dim hotel room in Vienna, Claire Besson had just stolen intelligence that would reshape the CIA's understanding of Soviet trade networks in Central Europe. And Viktor Sokolov, senior trade attaché, careful man, married man, never once suspected a thing. The film reached Langley 3 days later, carried by diplomatic pouch through Zurich. Donald Richter developed it himself in a windowless room on the 3rd floor, hanging the negatives to dry under red safe light. What he saw made him pick up the phone immediately. The documents weren't trade schedules. They were courier routes, specific dates, specific border crossings, specific names of KGB officers moving through Austria into West Germany and France. This was operational intelligence, the kind that could burn networks or save them. Richter called his section chief, a woman named Carolyn Marsh who'd spent 15 years running assets in Eastern Europe. She looked at the photographs for 3 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "We need more, and we need to know if he's testing her." Claire met Sokolov twice more that week, once for lunch at a cafe near the Hofburg, once for a late dinner in his hotel room. He was more relaxed now, more talkative. He told her about his childhood in Leningrad, about his daughter studying medicine in Moscow, about how much he missed Russian winters. Claire listened, asked gentle questions, touched his hand across the table. She was building trust, yes, but she was also watching for tells. For moments when his eyes lingered too long on her purse, or when he asked questions that felt rehearsed. So far, nothing. He seemed genuine. But Richter had warned her. Men like Sokolov don't survive in Soviet intelligence by being careless. If he suspects you, he won't confront you. He'll just disappear. So Claire stayed cautious. She varied her routes to the hotel. She checked for surveillance every time she left her apartment. And she never, ever, carried anything that couldn't be explained. The breakthrough came during their 5th meeting. Sokolov arrived at the hotel an hour late, visibly tense. He poured himself vodka instead of champagne, and sat by the window, staring out at the street below. Claire asked what was wrong. He hesitated, then said, "There are people in my delegation I don't trust." He didn't elaborate, but later, when he stepped out to make a phone call in the hallway, he left the briefcase open on the desk. Inside, a new file, thicker than before, with a red stamp across the cover. Claire didn't touch it. Not yet. She waited until he returned, until they'd moved to the bed, until his breathing had slowed into the rhythm of half-sleep. Then she slipped out from under the sheets, crossed the room in bare feet, and photographed every page. 12 minutes. 23 images. When she climbed back into bed, Sokolov murmured something in Russian and pulled her close. He never woke up. Langley processed the new intelligence within 48 hours. The red-stamped file contained names: Western businessmen, a few low-level diplomats, and 2 members of the Austrian parliament who'd been receiving payments from a front company tied to Soviet military procurement. It also contained something else, a reference to an internal investigation within the Soviet mission in Vienna. Someone suspected a leak, not from Sokolov directly, but from someone in his orbit. Carolyn Marsh read the report twice, then called Richter into her office. "Pull her out," she said. Richter shook his head. "We're too close. If we pull her now, we lose everything." Marsh stared at him. "If we don't pull her, we lose her." They compromised. Claire would stay, but only for 2 more weeks. After that, the operation would be shut down, the cover dismantled, and Claire Besson would vanish from Vienna as quietly as she'd arrived. Claire didn't know about the internal investigation. Richter hadn't told her. He thought it would make her nervous, make her sloppy. So she continued as before, meeting Sokolov, smiling, listening, stealing. But something had changed. Sokolov was more careful now. He stopped leaving the briefcase unattended. He started locking the hotel room door from the inside, even when he went to the bathroom. And once, when Claire reached for her purse, he asked, "What do you keep in there?" She laughed, opened it, showed him. Lipstick, a compact mirror, a pack of French cigarettes. He nodded, apologized for asking, but his eyes lingered on the purse for a moment too long. That night, after he fell asleep, Claire lay awake in the dark, listening to the sound of cars passing on the street below. She didn't feel afraid. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford, but she felt something else, a cold, quiet certainty that this operation was running out of time. The confrontation happened on a Thursday. Sokolov called her that morning, asked her to meet him at the hotel earlier than usual, 3 in the afternoon, not evening. Claire agreed, but the change in routine set off alarms. She told Richter. He told her to wear a wire. She refused. "If they sweep me, I'm dead," she said. Richter didn't argue. Instead, he positioned a surveillance team 2 blocks from the hotel, close enough to respond, far enough to stay invisible. Claire arrived at 2:55 p.m. The hotel lobby was empty except for the clerk, who didn't look up. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, knocked twice on the door to room 307. Sokolov opened it immediately. He wasn't smiling. Behind him, standing near the window, was another man. Younger, dark suit, hands folded in front of him. Claire's heart rate didn't change. She'd been trained for this. She stepped inside, set her purse on the table, and said in German, "I didn't know we were having company." Sokolov closed the door. The younger man didn't move. Sokolov said, "This is my colleague. He wanted to meet you." Claire turned to the colleague, extended her hand, smiled. "Claire Besson, pleased to meet you." The colleague didn't take her hand. He said, in lightly accented German, "You work as a translator, yes?" Claire nodded. "For a consulting firm in Brussels." The colleague glanced at Sokolov, then back at Claire. "We checked. There is no consulting firm at the address you gave." The room went very still. Claire didn't blink. She said, "That's because we're a subsidiary. The main office is in Antwerp. If you'd like, I can give you the phone number." The colleague studied her. 30 seconds of silence. Then he said, "That won't be necessary." He walked to the door, opened it, and left without another word. Sokolov exhaled, poured himself vodka with shaking hands. "I'm sorry," he said. "There have been concerns about security." Claire crossed to him, touched his face. "It's all right," she said softly. "I understand." But inside she was already planning her exit. If you're enjoying this, hit that subscribe button. Stories like this take time to research, and your support means everything. That night, Claire met Richter in a parked car near the Prater. She told him everything. Richter listened, then said, "You're done. We're pulling you out tomorrow." Claire shook her head. "Give me one more meeting. If they were going to arrest me, they would have done it today. That was a test. I passed." Richter stared at her. "Or they're setting you up for something worse." Claire met his eyes. "I didn't come this far to leave empty-handed. One more meeting, then I'm gone." Richter was quiet for a long time. Then he said, 72 hours. After that, I don't care what you've got. We burn the operation and get you on a plane." Claire nodded. She didn't tell him that she'd already seen something in Sokolov's briefcase that afternoon before the colleague arrived. A file marked with a name she recognized. A name Langley had been hunting for 2 years. A name that, if confirmed, would justify every risk she'd taken. Sokolov called her the next morning. His voice was warm again, apologetic. He wanted to see her that night. Claire agreed. She packed the leather purse one last time. Camera, lockpick, and now a small transmitter Richter had insisted she carry. "If anything goes wrong," he'd said, "press the button. We'll be there in 3 minutes." Claire didn't plan on pressing it. She arrived at the hotel at 8. Sokolov was waiting with champagne, candles, and almost desperate eagerness to prove that everything was normal. They talked, they laughed, and when he stepped into the bathroom, Claire moved. The briefcase was on the desk, unlocked. Inside, the file she'd seen before, thicker now, updated. She photographed it, 14 pages, 2 minutes. But as she closed the briefcase, she heard the bathroom door open. She turned. Sokolov stood in the doorway, staring at her. The camera was still in her hand. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. Then Sokolov said, very quietly, "Who are you?" Claire didn't answer. She set the camera on the desk, stood up slowly, and looked at him. Not with fear, not with apology, with something else. Something calm and cold and final. She said, "You should sit down, Victor." He didn't sit. He took a step forward. "Who do you work for?" Claire reached into her purse. Sokolov froze, but she didn't pull out a weapon. She pulled out a small leather wallet, flipped it open, and held it where he could see. Inside, a badge. Central Intelligence Agency. Sokolov stared at it. His face went pale. He said, "You're American?" Claire closed the wallet. "I'm sorry it had to be this way." Sokolov sat down on the edge of the bed, hands trembling. "They'll kill me," he whispered. "When they find out, they'll kill me." Claire looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Not if you come with me." The room was silent except for the sound of traffic outside. Sokolov looked up at her, confused. "What?" Claire knelt in front of him, spoke quietly, quickly. "You said there are people in your delegation you don't trust. I know who they are. I know what they're planning. If you stay, you'll be blamed for this leak whether you helped me or not. But if you come with us, we can protect you. New identity, new life. Your daughter too, if she'll come." Sokolov's eyes filled with tears. "I can't," he said. "She'll never leave Moscow." Claire nodded. She'd expected that. She stood up, picked up the camera, and walked to the door. She turned back once. "You have 48 hours before they figure this out. If you change your mind, go to the American embassy and ask for Donald Richter. He'll be expecting you." Then she opened the door and walked out. Sokolov didn't follow. He just sat there, alone in the dim hotel room, staring at the briefcase on the desk, the briefcase that had just cost him everything. Claire walked 4 blocks before Richter's team picked her up. She climbed into the back of a gray sedan, handed over the camera, and said, "We're done." Richter looked at her. "Did he make you?" Claire nodded. Richter swore softly. "Then we need to move fast. If he reports this, the Soviets will burn every asset we have in Vienna." Claire leaned back against the seat, closed her eyes. "He won't report it. Not yet. He's too scared." And she was right. Sokolov didn't report the breach. Not that night, and not the next day. He sat in his office at the Soviet mission, staring at files he could no longer read, knowing that his life had just been divided into before and after. 2 days later, he walked into the American embassy on Boltzmanngasse and asked for Donald Richter. 36 hours after that, Viktor Sokolov was on a military transport out of Austria, headed for a debriefing facility in West Germany. He never saw his daughter again, but he also never stood trial in Moscow. and the intelligence he provided over the next 18 months helped the CIA dismantle 3 Soviet networks operating in Western Europe. The file Claire photographed that final night contained more than courier routes. It contained the real name of a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover in Paris, a man the agency had been trying to identify for 3 years. His code name was Orlov. His real name was Yuri Petrov, and he'd been running a network of industrial spies targeting French aerospace companies. Within a week of Sokolov's defection, French intelligence arrested 4 of Petrov's assets. Petrov himself disappeared, presumably recalled to Moscow. The operation was considered a strategic success, but inside the CIA, questions lingered. How had a translator, a woman with no field experience before Vienna, managed to get this close to a senior Soviet officer without raising suspicion? Carolyn Marsh knew the answer. So did Donald Richter, but they didn't share it widely, not yet. That would have compromised something far more valuable than a single operation. Claire Besson returned to Washington in early March, 5 weeks after leaving Vienna. She didn't go back to Langley immediately. Instead, she spent 2 weeks at a safe house in rural Virginia, undergoing debriefing and psychological evaluation. Standard procedure after deep cover operations. The agency needed to make sure she hadn't been turned, that she wasn't carrying trauma that might compromise future work. The evaluations were thorough. Lie detector tests, cognitive assessments, long interviews with psychiatrists who'd spent careers studying people who lived double lives. Claire passed every test. She answered every question. But there was one question they didn't ask, because they didn't know to ask it. They didn't know that Claire Besson wasn't just a case officer running an operation. She was something else entirely, something the agency had been very careful to keep hidden, even from most of its own personnel. Her real name was Claire Drummond. She'd grown up in Michigan, daughter of a steel worker and a high school English teacher. She'd studied Russian and French at Georgetown, graduated summa cum laude, and been recruited by the CIA during her senior year. But the recruitment hadn't been for standard case officer training. It had been for something the agency called the Contingency Program, a small, classified initiative designed to create deep cover operatives who could be inserted into hostile environments with minimal support and maximum deniability. The program was run by a woman named Elizabeth Vance, a former Soviet analyst who'd spent the 1960s running agents in East Berlin. Vance believed that the best intelligence operatives weren't the ones who looked like spies. They were the ones who looked like everyone else. Teachers, translators, secretaries, people the enemy would never suspect until it was too late. Claire had been in the contingency program for 4 years before Vienna. Her first assignment, a 6-month operation in East Germany, posing as a Canadian graduate student researching Cold War literature. She'd successfully identified 2 Stasi officers recruiting informants on Western university campuses. Her second assignment, 8 months in Beirut, working as an administrative assistant at a shipping company that was secretly moving weapons for a Palestinian faction. She'd provided intelligence that helped the CIA intercept 3 arms shipments. Vienna was her third assignment, and it had been the most dangerous. Not because of Sokolov, he'd been predictable, manageable, but because of what the operation had revealed. The file with Orlov's real name hadn't been in Sokolov's possession by accident. Someone had placed it there, someone who wanted the CIA to find it. And that someone was still out there, still operating, still playing a game Claire didn't fully understand. Donald Richter met her at Langley on a cold morning in late March. They walked together through the marble lobby, past the stars carved into the wall, each one representing an officer killed in the line of duty. Richter didn't say anything until they reached his office on the 5th floor. Then he closed the door and said, "Sokolov gave us something you need to see." He handed her a file. Inside, transcripts of debriefing sessions, maps, photographs, and a name. Not Orlov, someone else. Someone Sokolov had been afraid of, someone he'd mentioned only once, in a whispered aside during his 3rd day of questioning. A woman, codename Lydia, a KGB officer assigned to internal security within the Soviet mission in Vienna. She'd been the one investigating the leak, and according to Sokolov, she'd known about Claire. Not her real identity, not her agency affiliation, but she'd known something was wrong. She'd been watching, waiting, and the file with Orlov's name, Sokolov believed Lydia had placed it there deliberately. A test, to see if the leak would take the bait. Claire stared at the file. "She let me photograph it," she said quietly. Richter nodded. "And now she knows we have it, which means she knows Sokolov talked, which means she's won." Claire looked up at him. "Won what?" Richter leaned back in his chair. "Credibility. Lydia fed us Orlov's real name, knowing we'd act on it. Now, when she feeds us something else, disinformation maybe, or a false defector, we'll be more likely to believe it, because she gave us a real victory first." Claire set the file down. "So we burned Orlov's network for nothing." Richter shook his head. "Not for nothing. We stopped real operations, saved real lives, but we also walked into a larger game, and Lydia's still playing." He paused. "The question is, what do we do about it?" Claire spent the next 3 days reading everything the agency had on Lydia. There wasn't much. Born in Moscow, 1943. Educated at Moscow State University. Recruited by the KGB in 1968. Assigned to Vienna in 1977. No photographs. No confirmed physical description. She was a ghost. Someone who existed only in the margins of other people's files. But Claire noticed something. Lydia had been present, at least peripherally, in 3 separate operations where Western intelligence had suffered significant setbacks. A blown defector in Rome, a compromised safe house in Athens, a double agent in Bonn who'd fed the CIA false intelligence for 18 months before being exposed. In each case, Lydia had been somewhere nearby, never at the center, always on the periphery. It wasn't proof, but it was a pattern, and patterns were what Claire had been trained to see. She requested a meeting with Elizabeth Vance. Vance's office was on the 7th floor, in a section of the building most case officers never visited. Vance was in her 60s now, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, with the kind of stillness that came from decades of watching people lie. Claire laid out what she'd found. Vance listened without interrupting. When Claire finished, Vance said, "You want to go after her?" It wasn't a question. Claire nodded. Vance was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Lydia isn't like Sokolov. She won't fall for charm or seduction. She's too smart, too careful. If you go after her, you'll need leverage. Something she wants more than she wants to protect herself." Claire asked, "What does she want?" Vance smiled faintly. "That's what you're going to find out." The operation took 9 months to plan. Claire returned to Europe, not to Vienna, but to Geneva, operating under a new cover, working for a Swiss bank that handled accounts for Eastern European clients. She didn't approach Lydia directly. Instead, she built a network around her, identifying Lydia's contacts, tracking her movements, mapping her vulnerabilities. It turned out Lydia had a weakness. Her younger brother, a dissident writer living in Moscow, under constant surveillance by the KGB. Lydia had protected him for years, using her position to keep him out of prison. But the protection was fragile. One misstep, and he'd disappear into the gulag. Claire saw the opening. She arranged for a letter to reach Lydia, a letter that suggested, in carefully coded language, that the CIA could help extract her brother if Lydia was willing to talk. Not defect, just talk. Lydia didn't respond, not for weeks. But then, in late November, Claire received a message. A meeting. Geneva. Neutral ground. Claire went alone. They met in a small cafe near Lake Geneva, just after dawn. Lydia was younger than Claire expected, late 30s, dark hair, unremarkable features. She could have been a schoolteacher or a bank clerk. She didn't smile when Claire sat down. She said in perfect English, "I know who you are." Claire nodded. "And I know who you are." Lydia stirred her coffee slowly. "You want something," Claire said. "So do you." They talked for an hour. Not about ideology, not about politics, about leverage, about survival, about the cost of loyalty. Lydia didn't defect. She didn't provide names or files. But she did something more valuable. She told Claire how Soviet intelligence identified and targeted Western operatives, the methods, the patterns, the mistakes that got people killed. In exchange, Claire arranged for Lydia's brother to receive a travel visa to East Germany, where he'd be safer, less scrutinized. It wasn't freedom. but it was something. When they stood to leave, Lydia said, "You should know. I let you win in Vienna. I wanted Orloff exposed." Claire asked, "Why?" Lydia looked at her with cold, tired eyes. "Because sometimes the only way to survive is to sacrifice someone else." Claire returned to Washington in January 1981, just as the Reagan administration was settling into power. She filed her report, attended the debriefings, and waited. 3 weeks later, Carolyn Marsh called her into her office. Marsh said, "The deputy director wants to meet you." Claire said, "Why?" Marsh smiled slightly. "Because Elizabeth Vance is retiring, and she recommended you to take over the contingency program." Claire felt something shift inside her. Not surprise, but recognition. She'd known, on some level, that this was where the path led. Not to field work forever, but to something larger. To the invisible architecture that made operations like Vienna possible. She accepted the position. Over the next decade, she trained 43 operatives. Some became legends, others died quietly, remembered only by stars on a wall. Claire herself never returned to the field. She didn't need to. She'd already proven what she was capable of. And more importantly, she'd learned the most important lesson intelligence work had to teach. That the people who looked the least dangerous were often the ones who changed everything. If this story moved you, or made you think, make sure you're subscribed. There are more stories like this waiting, and I'll see you in the next one.